Chapter 10. The Labyrinth. The spirals, or galaxies, which uncoil in their gigantic tentacles of light in dark space, are composed of innumerable stars or stellar systems gathered in an ensemble movement. The stars are able to be simple or composed. They are able, if one accepts that the solar system is not an exception in the immensity of the heavens, to be accompanied by a whirlwind of planets and, in the same way, the known planets are often doubled by satellites. Celestial bodies, whatever they are composed of atoms, but, at least if one considers those whose temperature is greatest, the atoms of the radiating stars have no possibility of belonging to any other particular composition at the interior of the star itself. They are in the dominion of the stellar mass and of its central movement. Quite the contrary with the atoms of the terrestrial periphery, of the crust and the atmosphere, which are free of this dominion. It is permissible for them to enter into composition in powers which possess a developed independence in relation to the dominion of the mass. The whole surface of the planet is formed not only of molecules each uniting a small number of atoms, but also compositions which are much more complex, some crystalline and some colloidal, the latter arriving at the autonomous powers of life, of the plant, of the animal, of man, of human society. The surface of the Earth is formed out of molecules. Each molecule unites a certain number of atoms. Molecules often unite themselves, forming groups of a colloidal or crystalline nature. It is such colloids which assemble themselves to compose the individuality of the living being, plant, animal, human, escaping in that fashion from the general movement of the world. They each constitute a little world apart for themselves. Animals are able to assemble amongst themselves in turn. Humans agglomerate themselves into little groups and the little groups into larger groups, then into states. At the summit of these compositions one finds oneself at the greatest distance from nature. Benoit Mandelbrot walks along a rocky shoreline in the evening. The edge of the land scales downwards through boulders, pebbles, gravel, beyond sand and into elusive extremities of complexity. The ocean is dark, suggestive of death. If the movement of a thing is always a change within a greater thing, it becomes equivalent to a partial dying. A flotsam of seaweed, small animals, fish eggs, biological detritus, and mineral particles infiltrates innumerable estuaries. It seems as if they are exploring new intricacies of proximity. Mandelbrot wonders whether how long is the coastline of Britain? Asks the same as how close can we get? How intertangled, how confused. Bodies are not volumes but coastlines, irresolvable but undelimitable penetrabilities, opportunities for the real decomposition of space. How many orifices has the human body? The osmotic transfusion of saline chemicals from a drop of alien perspiration impacts upon a cluster of epidermal cells as an annihilating copulation. As the third part of Bataille's inner experience meanders towards its insatiate termination in a splintered discussion of communication, it opens a confused and fissured space entitled the Labyrinth, or the composition of beings. Or rather, from a certain perspective, a certain scale, this space seems fissured, as if integrity were merely interrupted. The labyrinth is not an intervention into being, but an infestation or irresolvably complex collapse, replacing being with an illimitable corrosion. The labyrinth is precisely the positive impossible area of privileged scales, both the recurrence of irreducible detail across scales, and the recurrence of irreducible diversity in the transitions between scales. Complex heterogeneity is not suppressed by any refinement of focus, nor are simplicity, autonomy, elementariness, ever approached. Being is nowhere. The labyrinth is a complexity that cannot be determined as an extrinsic predicate of substance, one that returns the pretension of substantiality to the uncircumscribed recession of detailing which undoes it. When woven into the labyrinth, all substantiality succumbs to an unconceptualizable implosion, becoming the mere cipher for the unresolved precision of porosity. There is only relative simplicity and not being, or at least, being is diffused irrecoverable by its own labyrinthine construction. The labyrinth is constructed by a recurrence, a drifting replication and a replication of drift, that proliferates an apolar fission, two principles, transcendent composition of components, relative autonomy of components, regulates the existence of each being. Whatever the level or degree, there is never achieved totality or simplicity, but always composition, component, an insoluble compact of integration and complexity. I can, if need be, admit that developing from an extreme complexity, being imposes upon reflection more than an elusive appearance, but complexity, gradually increasing, is for this more labyrinth in which it wanders endlessly, then is lost once and for all. I do not have the least pretension to mathematical competence. My inability to subscribe to the superstition of number has crippled my intellect in this respect. Nevertheless, what little I understand about the influx of chaos themes into mathematics suggests that the discipline is being shifted in an encouragingly anti-Platonic direction, provoking me to make a few confused remarks. The very notion of a mathematics of chaos seems to suggest a grotesque domestication, such as the enfeeblement of chaos into a statistically intelligible randomness. For this reason my immediate reaction to the mathematics of chaos was one of visceral suspicion, even though a thread of 18th and 19th century German philosophy had prepared me for its topic. Nevertheless, it is not easy to imagine a mathematician ceasing to be a Platonist, nor easy to remain immune to the virological seduction of a geometry of the pitted, pocked, and broken up, the twisted, tangled, and intertwined as Glick summarizes it in his popularizing book, or to sustain an indifference to topological explorations characterized by mathematical orthodoxy as monstrous, disrespectful to all reasonable intuition about shapes and pathologically unlike anything to be found in nature. A glance at the purportedly chamorphic Sierpinski or Menger sponge both confirms and undermines such suspicions. It is a shape that is homogenized, saturated with equalities, inanely geometric, yet also irresolvable, paradoxical, unhealthy. A Menger sponge results from the endless recursion of a simple operation. A cube is divided into 27 identical smaller cubes, with the central block and each of the 6 orthogonally adjacent ones being removed. The resulting frame consists of 20 blocks, which are then all treated in the same way as the initial cube, and so on, recursively. Each transformation increases surface area with a tendency to infinity, and decreases volume with a tendency to zero. However far this process is taken, the sponge remains cohesive, and it is possible to trace a line in 3 dimensions from any point on the surface to any other. In its ideal conception, a Menger sponge is thus a model of infinitely complex immanence, a universe of endlessly intricate distances, without inaccessible depths or absolute ruptures. Exceeding a surface, but evading volume, the Menger sponge is a shape of between 2 and 3 dimensions, or of a fractional dimension, a fractal to use Mandelbrot's term. Like the Mobian band of the early Lyotard, or the smooth space of Deleuze and Guattari, it is a libidinal geometry. Without inaccessible recesses, a topography without transcendent repression. The Menger sponge confronts us as an immobile quasi-solid figure described, ungraspably, in space. This is intrinsic to its mathematical or ideal character. It is mapped in a geometry it does not disturb. Concepts of space, time, abstraction, and infinity remain uncontaminated. In this respect it is not a labyrinth, in Bataille's sense. It admits of absolute transcendence, subordination, ideal objectivity. It might nevertheless be a certain horizon of lucidity. Transcendental philosophy needs to be scaled, just as chaos theory needs deepening transcendentally. Between real scales there is always a difference of conditioned, but this difference is only ever scalar, never polar. Unlike a Menger sponge, the labyrinth cannot be expressed within a transcendent grid, since it maps an uncircumscribable terrain of immanence. Space and time find their construction in the labyrinth, or nowhere. Scale is an irreducible difference. In the end there is only the voiding of volume, in which space and time cooperate in utter continuity, chaos where everything is spent. Nevertheless, a stellar silt is pasted across the void like diseased skin, so that the ramifications of the sponge encrust death, forming a surface without real depth, in distributing distances across the scales. To ascend the sponge strato is to progressively transcend a position towards the intensive construction in which it is described. From superstructure, macrostructure to middle infrastructure, microstructure. Always a deeper infrastructure and a shallower superstructure, one ascends into profundity, but profundity is nothing but a complication of the shallows, and one is nowhere. On the one hand, 2 orientations or directions of focus, macrostructure and microstructure, on the other 2 states or qualifications of space, solidity and void. Between macrostructure and microstructure is a relation or difference of analogy and asymmetry. As compositions each stratum is analogous to the other, but as strata one is dissymmetrically composed by the other. Macrostructure is real crudity or blur, but its reality is something other than itself, it is blurred. Blur is real, but what is blurred is reality, microstructure. That which is blurred is not something other than blur, but what blur itself is. Blur is real, death trapped in confusion. Void excludes solidity, but solidity does not exclude void. This absence of reciprocity is the consequence of the fact that focus has dissimilar consequences for plenitude and void. void alone is ever strictly focused, and is thus unilaterally absolute. Death is perfect. At any level of composition what appears as void is void, but what appears as solidity is a compound involving the aggregate of the unfocused, both unfocused solidity and unfocused void. In appearance, a level of focus, void and solidity exclude each other, but in reality, the unfocused of any level of focus, its microstratum of composition, solidity is contaminated by void. Death is definitive, but life is indefinitely corroded by death. Solidity is in reality void, but reality is impossible, and inevitable. How is the relation between scale and its content to be interpreted? The dependency of solidity upon blur seems to suggest that the dissymmetries of both couples align, and that compositional ascension is generative of solidity. Blurring or scalar progression would in this case be equivalent to a variable deviation from void, so that composition is no longer thought of as static description, but as dynamic accumulation. This is the description Bataille gives in the accursed share, Inner Experience, on Nietzsche, and elsewhere. Growth is inextricable from the integrative impulse of scalar progression, in which the hierarchy of predation and of compositional organization are fused. Such a scale has a terminus but no origin, as a symptom of its basic asymmetry. Regression is without term, since there is always a subtilization of the tributary from which the anticipations of solidity gather, as they flow into the macrostructural basins of organization. Progression, however, tends, irrepressibly, to empty itself into the sea. In other words, there is, as Bataille insists, a summit. If I now compare the constitution of society to a pyramid, it appears as a domination on the part of the center of the summit. This is a rough, even difficult scheme. The summit incessantly throws the foundation off into insignificance and, in this sense, waves of laughter traverse the pyramid by gradually contesting the pretense of sufficiency of the beings placed at a lower level. But the first pattern of these waves issued from the summit flows back and the second pattern traverses the pyramid from the bottom to the top. The flowing back this time contests the sufficiency of beings placed at a higher level. This contestation, on the other hand, right up to the last instant, preserves the summit. It cannot however fail to reach it. In truth, being, without number, is in a certain sense suffocated by a reverberating convulsion. Laughter, in particular, suffocates no one, but if I envisage the spasm of multitudes, whom one never takes in with a single glance, the flowing back, as I have said, cannot fail to reach the summit. And if it reaches it? This is the agony of God in black night. Imagine an irregular Menger sponge, scaling downwards in a similar way to the Mandelbrot set, diversifying, and thus without predictability across scales, except for that of protracted scaling itself. Once its differences have been stripped of periodicity, it must be impossible to return to the same. Something happens that is like a becoming, liquefying matter, space into a mutating complexity of flows, with differentiated vectors and speeds, still recursively conserving detail. Currents drift across the omnisurface, and within the currents are subcurrents, and within the subcurrents, with each seeming to float on a pseudo-volume generated by unresolved involutions of the sponge plane. A force floating in sponge space has no determinate speed, but traverses distances proportionate to a level of resolution, digressing with its microcomponents into complexities that indefinitely protract their voyage. Any 2 points in sponge space, whilst immanent to each other, map out an unsimplifiable distance that cannot be traversed at all scales in any given period. Contrary to anything that a superficial similarity to Zeno's paradox might suggest, this does not result from the formal character of an argument, but rather, from the material characteristics of a terrain. Sponge space is the positive impossibility of resolvable boundaries, and thus of discrete entities, decidable actions, unproblematic vectors, logical identities, and adequate representations. There are no representations of any kind, but only floating plates or scales, immanently distanced from each other by an indeterminably convoluted surface. In sponge space, pure spatiality cannot be demarcated from matter as a discrete concept, but conspires with matter in the sole reality possible to either. Complexity. Distances are proliferated amongst the oceanic detritus of a receding shoreline, with the prospect of an ideal university diffused irreparably into the recurrent detail of base matter. You would not be able to imagine the degree of aberration to which it is possible to arrive. Sponge space is a scale of beings, scale of composition, or scale of forms which does not tend to simplicity, ideality, or purity in either direction, which never becomes cephalic, capped, teleological, a headless axis of recession. I teach you the friend and his overflowing heart. But you must understand how to be a sponge if you want to be loved by overflowing hearts. Thus spoke Zarathustra. Reason is rotted to bits in sponge space, because all the polar concepts which provide its structure depend upon the repression of scaling differences. Form is infested by matter, the abstract by the concrete, the transcendent by the immanent, space by time. It is not only ideal, real, actual, virtual, infinite, finite, simple, complex that succumb, but also Euclidean, fractal, absolute, scaling, consistent/sponge. Life is infested by death, terminally infiltrated by the unsuspendable reality of its loss. There is no integral identity or alterity, but only fuzzy sponge zones, pulsing with indeterminable communicative potencies. Not merely lethal diseases, but the disease of lethality, a labyrinth of contagion, knitted irresolvably into death. Chaotic geometries, but they are not geometries, diseases, fluids, war, vermin, and desire, all aspects of irreducible mess. A mess that does not have the simplicity of amorphousness, homogeneity, entropy, or consistent slime. No, this is a real mess, imperfectible, unthinkable, even by negation. Mess is not liquid, but differentially liquidated, fractional at each level between a solidity and a liquidity that mean nothing on their own, a power of infiltration that cannot be polarized. The parts of a liquid have velocities, traced in geometric space, and polarized between immobility and the rapidity of light. But the components of a fluidification have speeds, spatializations, or differential rates of becoming. These are recursive complications of geometry, arbitrarily projectable as deviating from an energetic norm, illimitable in both scalar directions. Velocities can be represented geometrically, but speeds shape space. Which is to say, there is no transcendental space, no spatiality that is ultimate, whether highest or most basic, no final grid, topology, or terrain. No absolute geometry or legislative stratum. There are only scales in which everything happens, a labyrinth which can never be placed in perspective. Space itself is deep and twisted, a mortuary abyss of debauchery, which is not at all to suggest that it has three dimensions. Its depth does not retreat from surface, except as a maze-like complication. Sponge space has the depth of Nietzschean eternity, a depth of endless intrication hollowed by recursion and asynchronicity. Far from being synonymous with a spatial dimension, the profundity of space stems precisely from the impossibility of any geometric or cartographic master position from which scales could be plotted in consistent space. Nor can time be exteriorized in relation to space, since both are co-effectuated as recursivity, or incomprehensibly diffuse encroachment. It is not any transcendentally spatialized objectivity, but spatiality as such that is abyssally complicated through scaling. I fall into the immensity which falls into itself. It is blacker than my death. The difference between transcendence and immanence is a matter of volume and encroachment. In the recession through scales, volumes are dissymmetrically devastated by encroachments, and yet sponge space, as a whole, never reverts to the simplicity of a void. The unilateral erosion effected by real death corrupts being with an interminable complication. Transcendence is similarly powerless against the ferocious indifference of immanence, losing every encounter, eroded a little further each time, but in a process that never resolves into homogeneous negation. The most philosophically rigorous discussion of this difference in Bataille's writings is to be found in his theory of religion, which was probably written during the mid to late 1940s, and appeared finally in 1974. It is here that he most fully delineates his thought of transcendence, a term which he consistently employs throughout his more theoretical texts to designate the state of separation. As he remarks, the object has a sense that breaks with indistinct continuity, which opposes itself the immanence or to the flowing of all that is, that it transcends. It is rigorously alien to the subject, to the ego drowned in immanence. This is not to say that there is first an ego for which the object is then separated by its transcendence. It is rather that ego and object are simultaneous hypostatizations of interrupted flow. What could an I be that lacked all distinctness, hemorrhaging freely into death, and lost in immanent immensity, where there are no separations, or limits? All three of the traditional schemas of difference, logical, empirical, and transcendental, presuppose the prior distinction between subject and object. At the most straightforward, this is because, in their modern sense, all three have been historically fixed in an epistemological usage, asking, how does a subject come to know an object? Transcendental philosophy sophisticates the subject-object relation, but maintains its fundamental orientation, such that Kant's most celebrated achievement was to have consummated epistemology, in a way that is inherited and trivially readjusted by our contemporary philosophy of science. This is not to suggest that the difference between subject and object remained unquestioned between the 16th and 18th centuries. On the contrary, almost all the central concepts of philosophy in play from Descartes to Kant have served at some stage to investigate and determine this difference. The question that remains repressed in the history of Western philosophy up to Kant is not that of the articulation between subject and object, but that of the difference between the subject-object distinction itself, knowing, and inarticulate or non-objective materiality, unknowing. At the apex, with Kant, a reason is given for this silence, but the question as to the real difference at the root of knowing is only raised in order to be judged impossible, because difference, by this time, belongs utterly to the internality of the subject. Epistemology takes as its problem the relation of a subjective representation to what is objectively represented, which might be problematic, skepticism, or unproblematic, dogmatism, one of difference, realism, or identity, subjective idealism, but what is evaded in this whole calculus of permutations is the relation between knowing, subject/object separation, and what is not knowing, or the sense of what escapes thought other than as an unknown object, which is to say, other than as the real thing behind the representation of the object. Kant's noumenon is still this. In order to differentiate between the real correlate of the object, or epistemologically determine real substance, and the unconditioned unknown, Bataille does not refer merely to matter, but to base matter, a materiality so alien to the epistemological framework that it is utterly without dependence upon the form of the object, the thing. The thing is the instance of a petrified separation, a fetish which represses both indistinct immanence and the difference from indifferentiation. This is because the immanence buried beneath the crust of things is the common but complex source of difference in, intensive gradations of, transcendence, the generative materiality in which everything real in transcendence must abysmally participate, and from which every separation or isolation must draw its force, but only in trailing an Ariadne's thread that escapes it, winding into obscure exteriority. Differentiation is continuity, from which only sclerosed, formalized, or structuralized differences depart, and depart only to the scale of their fictiveness. There is a certain sense in which transcendence is untruth, a utilitarian falsification or veil of Maya, and Bataille says of the thing that it is insofar that it is transcendence that it is fiction, but the premature exercise of such a judgment leaves immanence stranded in the inertia of a being in itself, isolated from the process of its falsification, and thus pent back within its theological determination as passive resource. It is important, therefore, to emphasize that what is real in transcendence is not merely immanence, but also the difference from immanence, which remains immanent. The sense in which transcendence is real is not the transcendent sense of reality, which is to say that reification, emergence of things, is the reality of unreality, rooted not in thought, or in any other transcendent faculty of falsification, but rather in the differentiation of immanence, the knotted unconscious complicity through which nature stratifies itself. Insofar as the thing is false, transcendent, it does not derive its sense from the real rupture which realizes its intensive deviation from continuity, but from the inert articulations through which it is related to other discrete beings. The price mechanism of market economies systematizes this tendency at the highest degree of its possibility, instituting an automatism of reification that is fueled by its own consequences, so that it insinuates equivalences between things ever more intricately into the fabric of the world. Matter is stacked as transcendence, but if the relation of transcendence to immanence can be described as hierarchical, it is only by wrenching the word from its Nietzschean usage, and thus employing the words metaphysically, without scaling. Where Nietzschean hierarchy, developing Schopenhauer's grades of objectification, is a matter of strata, scales, compositional levels, irresolvable tributaries open to the sea, labyrinthine in Bataille's sense, the so-called hierarchy of binary difference, polarity, and dialectic is infinitized and sterile. It is the whole of Nietzschean hierarchy which is immanent, unilateral, whilst polar hierarchy institutes transcendence. Or rather, the difference between immanence and transcendence has no absolute measure, but changes its sense according to the site of differentiation. It can certainly be construed transcendentally, as a definitive rupture of commensuration, generating the ontology which Nietzsche incessantly mocks as that of the real and apparent world. Such polar thinking hypostatizes strata. Difference into the concept of superiority as such, equals God. The strata of immanence transcend each other unilaterally, overcome each other to persist with Nietzsche's vocabulary, but they do not transcend the materiality of scaling as such. There is no such thing. Not spirit but spiritualization, densely material throughout its process. In their immanent usage, transcendence and immanence mark out the directionalities of a differentiation, relative serial coordinates, phases of intensity. They are not determinate concepts, but pronominal traffic signals on the intensive sequence, provoking exacerbations. Direction not concept, experiment not approximation. Although there can be no question of thought being adequate to sponge matter, this does not make the issue of its inadequacy an uninteresting one. Adequacy exactly describes the ideal of an absolutely depressive pole of economy. The absence of all abbreviation. More fundamentally, the thought of adequacy is construed within a vulgar realism, and is thus quite blind to the convoluted surface of the sponge, upon which the tangled paths of immanence are traced. Between thought and the sponge there is not a relation of transcendence, epistemic representation, but one of intricate texture. Thought is not remotely comprehensible to a philosophy of reflection, because it never grasps more than a surface of itself. Thought is no more representable by an idealized limit than by a general concept, since it has no privileged stratum of realization, no horizon of subtilization. Every thought, intellectual synthesis, or association of ideas is a pattern of convolution that is only ever apprehended under conditions of indeterminable summarization. Even the crudities and failures of thinking unfold upon the terrain of an illimitable complexity. So it is not just that on the sponge matter surface the shortest distance between 2 points is something other than a straight line. Such a distance is not even finalizable. Crudity enables things to happen, contra zeno, but only under the conditions of an imperfection whose potentialities for evolution escape definition. A provisional differentiation is obviously possible between elementary sponges, such as Bataille's groping example of the siphonophore, and scaled sponges for which being is composed irreducibly, such as Menger's. An elementary sponge might also be a scaled sponge, but of an extremely disequilibrated kind. It has a privileged stratum of fission, which is a threshold at which death vertiginously transforms its sense. A siphonophore can be dissolved to the level of its cells and still recompose itself, but dissolution below this level annihilates it. In the same way, a hive of bees or a colony of termites can be disaggregated without irreparable damage, which does not hold for the dismemberment of the individual insects composing them. Yet even in these cases the matter is more complex. Sex cells, viruses, nutrient compounds, and other components circulate upon differentiated strata, irreducible to specifiable economies of life and death. The death of a highly organized animal triggers a crisis across a large spectrum of its biochemical composition, but it does not precipitate a return to some zero degree of chemical organization. Under natural circumstances the compositional stock of such a creature is rapidly plundered, its proteins and fats redistributed into new hierarchies by scavengers of all kinds. Cultural organisms are able to treat texts and other detritus of life in an analogous fashion. Sard's thought begins to stray into the labyrinth when he writes. Now then, what value can nature set upon individuals whose making costs her neither the least trouble nor the slightest concern? The worker values his labor according to the labor it entails and the time spent creating it. Does man cost nature anything? And, under the supposition that he does he cost her more than an ape or an elephant? I go further, what are the regenerative materials used by nature? Of what are composed the beings that come into life? Do not the three elements of which they are formed result from the prior destruction of other bodies? If all individuals were possessed of eternal life, would it not become impossible for nature to create any new ones? If nature denies eternity to beings, it follows that their destruction is one of her laws. Now, once we observe that destruction is so useful to her that she absolutely cannot dispense with it, and that she cannot achieve her creations without drawing from the store of destruction which death prepares for her, from this moment onward the idea of annihilation which we attach to death ceases to be real. There is no more veritable annihilation. What we call the end of the living animal is no longer a true finis, but a simple transformation, a transmutation of matter, what every modern philosopher acknowledges as one of nature's fundamental laws. What is crucial to the labyrinth, maze, or composition of beings is that the word individual is not able to serve as a designation for a degree of the scale of forms. Each element is corrupted by an irreducible organizational fabric that opens across the difference of scale. I am led to propose to speak of aggregate if it is a matter of associations which do not modify the parts forming it, of composed beings when it is a matter of atoms, cells, or elements of the same order. Simple animals such as sponges and starfish are characterized by a relatively loose assemblage of cells, whilst linear animals, such as insects or vertebrates, exhibit a more complex mode of composition in which the organic elements succumb more profoundly to their integration. In his early sacred sociology writings, Bataille employs the distinction between colonies and societies to mark this difference between aggregated and scaled multiplicities. A society is an assemblage or composition which does not consist of individuals possessing a greater ontological density than its own, and this absence of privileged scale meshes it inextricably with death, the unlocalizable zero of community. The elements of a society are thus vampirically drained towards the nuclear whole, just as they are agitated in their integrity by the ineliminable flows at a lower degree on the scale of composition, lending the labyrinth a double aspect. Such particles, more spongiform than sponges themselves, are irreparably violated by their constellation into the dissipative mass of the labyrinth. General economy is a traffic system, marking routes within the complex immanence or quasi-horizontality that infests the axis of transcendence. Every vertical difference is collapsible onto a tangled horizontal flow. It is not that base materialism denies the necessity of vertical articulation. There is no tendency to delete the vocabulary of summits and troughs, differences in intensity, compositional strata. The elimination of such an axis from materialist thought would leave nothing but a theologically constituted reality abandoned by God, a colony of particles. Scaling is the positive superfluity of God inherent to matter, but its gradations of relative transcendence must be commensurated with an impersonal nature exhausting the real, genealogically rather than metaphysically explored. The labyrinth is the unconscious of God, or the repressed of monotheism. The illusion of ego in general requires that it remain unthought. What God really was is something incompatible with anything being at all. Real composition is not extrinsically created nature, but if this is a Spinozism, it is one in which substance itself is sacrificed to the scales. So that atheism is in the end, an end without end, an immense sponge, a megasponge, the dissolution of boundaries in all of its positive complexity. It is an inexhaustible porosity, saturated with negation, pregnant with swarming lethalities, and drunk upon the sea. Sponge matter, encroached without limit by silence, is the same thing as fate. In any traffic system real transition precedes articulation, which means that there are no boundaries, but only digressions. Sponge vectors do not connect pre-existing points, but spawn decomposable patches from out of the subtilization of speeds and the intricate crisscrossing of routes. Absolute points are transcendent mirages, hyperbolically projected out of dismantled vector nets. The reality of space is only the possibility of flow. Were you to stop a short moment, the complex, the gentle, the violent movements of worlds will make of your death a splashing foam, writes Bataille. The word death has the same mix of referential richness and conceptual poverty as the sign lifting a speed restriction. It would designate a concept only if this semiotic transition were treated as the representation of absolute velocity, rather than an incitement to free flow. Dying is the departure from a traffic system, but this emigration is not transcendentally governed by a pure destination. The slipping away of an animal into death is no less intricately positive than the arterial pulse pumping the blood from its heart. We are all fictional suicides, some impatient, some less so, but all demonstrating by our meticulousness the taciturnity of death. In effect, death is nothing in immanence, but due to the fact that it is nothing, no being is ever truly separated from it. Death answers sponge streaming with solar dreams. And straightway one of them ran, and took a sponge, and filled it with vinegar, and put it on a reed, and gave him to drink. And one ran and filled a sponge full of vinegar, and put it on a reed, and gave him to drink. They filled a sponge with vinegar, and put it upon his soup, and put it to his mouth. Dying is inextricable from the harsh flame of sexual torture in which one is progressively consumed. It does not patiently await its consummation, but gnaws at the base of the brain, grinding each life into eroticized debris. Survival dissolves as a franable dam does, eroded to bits by the tumult of energetic rage, so that sexual craving is the howl of nature's fringe pounded into trash by the sun. Life is a scream which one cannot desire to ameliorate. It is rather that one would exacerbate it. Agony alone has the power to seduce us, and it is to our most savage torments that we most ardently ding. We know that a life which was not torched into charcoal by desire would be an unendurable insipidity. Pain, however, remains pain. A word that is easily written. Perhaps there is little point in remarking upon it. One could imagine innumerable spurious reasons for reiterating the word scream, for instance. That life itself is filthy hurt. Who could care about this being discussed? Everyone and no one, as Nietzsche suggests. Eroticism would be impossible, if it were not that we know ourselves to be an unuttered howl, a scream. Nothing is more hypocritical than our public desexualization, the wretched urbanity with which we have replaced communication. Sexuality can be survived, we mutter with each dilute gesture, but of course, it cannot. We prevaricate until secreted in a liquid space, so often hidden at the lip of sleep, and then admit by our abandonments that everything is pregnant with death. My wish to vomit persisted. It hadn't ceased, so to speak, since the day before last. I went to look for a bottle of bad champagne. I drank a chilled glass of it. After a few minutes I got up to go and vomit. After vomiting I went back to bed. I was slightly comforted, but the nausea wasn't long in returning. I was gripped by trembling and chattering of the teeth. I was obviously sick. I suffered in a very bad fashion. I fell back into a sort of fearful sleep. Everything began to come unhooked, things that were obscure, hideous, unformed, that it was absolutely necessary to stabilize. There was no way to do so. My existence came apart like rotten matter. The semiology associated with the death of the author is formulated in terms of an antinomy of authority. It accepts a question of intention, proceeds to resolve it negatively, and then moves on to a theory of indeterminate significations which valorizes the process of reading. What is at stake in the cruder variants, baths, is a dialectic of authority which redistributes the sight of legislation from writer to reader. More intricate accounts take things further, so that with Lacan and Derrida the position of authority is itself subverted by the general text, in which the reader as much as the author was always already enmeshed and surpassed. In all of these cases death is thought of as the necessity that something does not reach us, and could never reach us. The transcendental impossibility of anything reaching us builds death, castration, into the movement of signification, as the arch-absentiality that articulates, effaces base contact. It is hard to imagine that anything could prevent Bataille's writing being flipped speculatively into this mirror space of frustrated representation, but this does nothing to increase the persuasiveness of such a move. If one is first prepared to think of the death infesting Bataille's writing as his death, in a gesture that can then be transcendentally exacerbated to undermine the general possibility of the proper, and thus of the onus of death, whilst nevertheless retaining the pathos of a ruined presence, then Bataille can indeed be deconstructed, with considerable technical meticulousness. Nowhere in this procedure is the contagious positivity of death touched upon. It is a matter of principle that nothing is touched upon, nor its fluidity, intensity, explosive impersonality, or solar luxuriance. Always the titillation of suspended meaning, and never the impact of oblivion. Loss is thought as a deduction from anticipated lucidity, not as a variable positive veracity. On the one hand death as the ultimate nostalgia of signification, on the other death as the virulent flux of communication. It is not that Bataille or his signifying intentions are blocked by death, it is rather that death is blocked by civilization in such a way that it is, merely, represented as an impossible signification, or as an impossibility of signification. That Bataille should arise as a hermeneutic topic, more or less problematized by the empirical or transcendental death of the person, is itself the symptom of a far more basic inhibition, operating at a level continuous with impersonal death. In other words, death is not the principle of the ascetic law of representation, but the final term of the forbidden. With every word that one writes about Bataille one compounds a misunderstanding, contributing to an ordered representation of crime and oblivion. It could be said that the issue here is that of a paradox, but that is mere subordination to a philosophical lexicon, and thus definitive resignation to an accumulative outcome. More urgent by far is the mixture of nausea and fear that accompanies the pre-philosophical impact of Bataille's dilemma, a vertiginous slippage upon the immanence of death. It is then that one grasps every word, read or written, as a desperate scrabbling for escape from isolation. The putting to death of the author by his work, writes Bataille, before quoting an astonishing passage from Proust in Inner Experience. After doing so he resumes the thread. The gods to whom we sacrifice are themselves sacrifice. Tears wept to the point of dying. This in remembrance of things past which the author would not have written if, broken with pain, he had not yielded to that pain, saying, "Let us allow our bodies to disintegrate." What is this if not the river, flowing in advance to the estuary, which is the sentence itself, "Let us." And the open sea into which the estuary empties is death. So much so that the work was not only what led the author to his tomb, but the way in which he died. It was written on his deathbed. The author himself wanted us to feel him dying a bit more at each line. It is only when authors are something other than their death that a literary theory can surgically excise them, when between themselves and their inexistence no communication or continuity occurs. The condition of impossibility for a theory of authorial absentiality receives a precise nomination in Bataille's text, literature, one can readily accept that Bataille's discursivity comprises an analyzable semiotic system. It remains only to note one urgent fact, that such discursivity is the thing sacrificed by his text. Of as completes to Georges Bataille is a discursive label. The genitive is problematic, of course, as is the proper name, but so are all the elements. Not only works, but complete works. It scarcely seems probable. What do we find in these texts after all? Even at the discursive level they seem to suggest that individuality, creativity, and possession are illusions, that literature is something quite other than work, and that completion is inevitably aborted. They dramatize their gaps, absences, discontinuities, repudiate their authenticity, contest themselves. The rafts of coherence one finds are always adrift in disorder and confusion. Tortured juxtapositions, fragments, and abandoned plans abound. Techniques of disintegration operate at all levels of Bataille's text, tending to distribute it along an axis of maximal fission. The extreme instance of this is the anorexic attenuation typical of his poetry, where the line is stripped of almost all its semantic and syntactic burden to enter into a vertical series of discontinuous cries. The line collapses towards a resilient spinal cord, along which shrunken stanzas unstring themselves, like beads, dropping from a broken necklace into a dimension of intoxicating descent. Other techniques include extended ellipsis, the employment of two separate gears of paragraphing, with both indentations and vertical line breaks, violent narrative shifts of various kinds. But in the end it is not a matter of technique. The fragmentation of Bataille's text cannot be domesticated within the subjective genitive. Death itself dissipates, aborts, fragments. Stories forestall completion, organization is lost, draft is spliced corrosively with accomplishment. Whose completion and whose work? Bataille's. His editors? Ours? As we have already glimpsed, there are innumerable theories of the text which might intervene at this point, attempting to persuade us one way or another. Some of these theories are even genealogically contaminated by Bataille's writings, although never more than tangentially so, but what they tend to share amongst themselves is a predisposition to an epistemological, ontological, or ethico-political register, and a certain sanitary distanciation from what matters to the text. The epistemophiliac fixation proper to theory, with its attachment to security, regularity, generalizability, and other cultural forms of insulation, might lead to possible readings of Bataille, but not to a communication. A pestilential seduction by these words purveyors of the plague. Bataille is less an interesting writer than a loathsome vice, and to be influenced by him is less a cultural achievement than a virological horror, far closer to the spasmodic rot of untreated syphilis than to the enrichment of an intellect. Any theorized death of the author domesticates the infectious wastage through which Bataille's incompletion is spread. His is not the immaculate absence of the semiologists, but a filthy death, as senselessly unmanageable as a scream. We are touched abysmally by the very gesture that removes every authentic trace of his existence from us. His disappearance is a violent communion. In the embers and smudges we inherit under the mark of Bataille something is deliberated which subverts all possibility of deliberation, as chance and failure are meticulously facilitated, and teleology undoes itself at its peak. Strategy runs itself into chaos in the incomprehensible zone where accidents are planned, and where desire flows freely into loss of control. Will to chance. Ashes to ashes, mess to mess, a virulent irregularity continued into the complexities of a literary estate. Into a chaos of books and papers. Death is a completion of sorts, one supposes. This is comforting enough to believe, and thus almost certainly untenable. How pleasant, to be rounded off by one's abolition, to be edited by death. This is a way of thinking similar to that of all those who assume they will get better at death, that age will ease them gently into her cold arms. This dream of soft passage is like that of tradition, inheritance, legacy and memorial, conceiving writing on the model of transmission. It is thought as if it were essentially something received, offering itself successfully to the consummating fulfillment of a deciphering, however tantalizingly problematical this may be. Not only does such a model serve as an implicit apologetics for the cultural commodity process, it also trivializes by idealization the mute catastrophe of writing. That the immensely preponderant bulk of writing is lost forever is not a mere empirical accident, far less a phenomenologic transcendental structure of non-presence but an effect inherent to the nihilistic core of the literary impulse. At its root literature is writing for nothing, a pathological extravagance whose natural companions are poverty, ill health, mental instability, and all the other symptoms of a devastated life that is protracted in the shadow of futility. In the current organization of civilization, the facility of contacting a text is, at the very least, radically accidental with respect to its literary intensity. The bare minimum of honesty requires an acknowledgement that literature is spent almost entirely unattended. It is as foreign to us in our social being as an earthquake beneath the sea. Confronting the absolute posed by our inevitable extinction, we feel brave, proud of ourselves. We permit ourselves a little indulgence, swooning in the delectations of morbidity. To face up to death is more than the others do. Our haunted grimace becomes a complacent smile. We run our hands lovingly over the lichen-spattered graves. It is as if we have done our share, as if it were now up to death to make some gesture of reciprocation, of gratitude. How thankful death will be that we accept it so. It will surely favor us for treating it so tolerantly. We even imagine it as an outcast, rejected by all, miserable, hungry, endlessly appreciative of the benefactor who takes it in. Thus it is that death becomes cut to our dimensions, becomes our death, a friend, a little ominous perhaps, a little bleak-hearted, but limited by the modest horizon of its task, that of bringing a definitive end to ourselves. We sit on tombs and imagine the corpse within lying alongside its death, the two of them, snuggled together as lovers, mutually satiated by the perfection of their symmetry. What fidelity death shows! What simplicity to its desires! And how cruelly it is spurned! In the final phase of this insanity we find ourselves choked with pity for our dark and neglected twin. How gentle and soothing, if death were really nothing but ceasing to be. But is there such a thing as mere death? Whether to be we would never learn of it, for it is only in overreaching itself that death leaves a script. What greater mistake than confusing our death with non-being? Is it because we want to believe in the loyalty of our substance that we make this peculiar equation? If so, we should be ashamed of our dishonesty. The facts are blatant. It is not the case that death leaves matter satisfied. At most it is a temporary refreshment, a cool black wave for matter to bask in like a reptile, a phase of dormancy, before the rush back into the convulsive dissipation of life. Perhaps we feel that our deaths should be more fulfilling, that they should be important enough to quench the most insensate thirst. It is almost as if we still believe in the faithful resurrection of the flesh. How humiliating then that matter remains itchy after shaking us from it, that it is still eager, that even before our mourners have forgotten us it is flirting with the worms. Across the aeons our massive hydrocarbon enjoys a veritable harem of souls. How much dying can a body do? At least one dose, and even this figure is conservative except in the case of the most elementary life. A more complex organism is a true economy of death, running off or perpetuated in a catastrophe, shedding its cells into the ocean of ruin. It is the crudest type of error to reserve the word death for total systemic collapse, for the end of dying. Human bodies do not echo the neuroses that inhabit them, staving off disintegration, clutching at postponement, sealing death out. No, they glut themselves on death, traders in devastation, turning themselves over from within. Matter is in flight from the possibility of essence as if from an original pertinency of ontology, and life is merely the most aberrant and virological variant of this flight, the convulsive fringe of being's relinquishment. Life is an exploration of death, whose motor is an exteriority from which it can never separate itself. It comes closest to coextension with a principle in its deviation from the echoes of real essence, in its turnover or metabolism. Life smears itself across death as the migration from concrete existence, the meanderings of an ever-accentuated vagrant reproducibility through confusion. No particle is the same, we happily admit, when discussing a body differentiated from itself by a few years. We try not to understand that we are thus accepting the final abandonment by complex life of all allegiance to existence. Life evolves into the embrace of death, becoming a mere turbulence of disappearance, indifferent to its pullulating in a mass, to its inner ruthlessnesses. To be part of an organism is to become dispensable, and ever more dispensable. No course is more suicidal than that of the living substance that becomes an organ. But ill writes of the human being for whom the components die incessantly, such that none of the elements that we were subsists beyond a certain number of years. We are still determined to believe that we have one single unconclusive death awaiting us, a death tailored to the dimensions of a soul. But if a body is a river of death, what makes us so sure a self isn't one? Is it likely that we should really remain the same? It is the most elementary common sense to believe in our existence, of course, but then, would it really be convenient for the body to admit to the ephemera in its nerves that it has so little attachment to them? animals of the species Homo sapiens, it is rashly suggested, know that they are going to die. Bataille claims so on a very great number of occasions. If this is so, it is perplexing why they act as they do. Nowhere outside humanity is the indefinite postponement of life, named difference in recent times, developed to such a pitch of wretchedness. Which amongst our gestures would remain unchanged if it were to be the last? No impulse amongst us that is not a hesitation. No adventure without reserve. The relation between being and death is commonly understood in one of two ways. Either existentially, such that death is thought of as an absolute loss of being in the world, or naturalistically, such that being is considered to be utterly unimpaired, merely rearranged, by death. For the implicit existentialist, who is everyone in their moments of naivety, both being and death belong absolutely to that scale consistent with the totality of the human person, whilst for the naturalist being recedes towards a level of fundamental elements, a level at which death is always extrinsic. Heideggerian death is an absolute ontological horizon, whilst thermodynamic heat death, comprehending all natural deaths, is merely energy-conserving disorder. With Bataille things are different. Being is nowhere. Which is to say, it has no privileged scale, no refuge, either in the atom or in the totality. From the perspective of ontology, the compositions at each scale are gnawed by insufficiency, both too friable and too partial to he. Being would be other to death, either annihilated by it or left immaculate, were there not scales. If there were not scales, death would be so sublimely metaphysical. Take Aquinas for instance. There is no gesture exhibiting a greater fidelity to theology than the differentiating stroke with which he distinguishes decomposition from annihilation. Along with such a difference comes the entitlement to an entire flora and fauna of theistic distinctions: soul, body, essence/accident, creation, metamorphosis, etc. The scales as a whole are grouped together upon the ontological fundament of divine conservation, within which empirical death circulates as an obedient angel of the Lord. Aquinas' reason is of crystal clarity. What is created comes out of nothing, ex nihilo. Now composite things, compositor, come out of their components, componentibus, not nothing, and therefore it is not them exactly that are created matter, materia, underlies natural production, and consequently it, and not the concrete thing composed of it, compositum, is what, properly speaking, is created. A simple bilateral disjunction between being and nothing propels Aquinas' thinking here. The economy of being operates within a consistent conservative action, monopolized by an extrinsic author who interdicts any impulse on the part of nature to a direct collaboration with zero. Compositional strata are quarantined from logical differentiations, ghettoized in the sordid slums of a creation that is paternalistically comprehended by divine reason. God is the cause of things through his mind and will, like an artist of works of art. Chapter 11. Inconclusive Communication. I am so weak sometimes that I lack the strength to write. The strength to lie. I must put it like this. The words that I lie. I wouldn't write on the walls of my prison. I would have to tear out my nails to seek the issue. Write? Turn one's nails against oneself, hope, completely uselessly. The moment of deliverance? My reason to write is to reach B. That which would consummate despair, that B loses in the end the thread of Ariadne, which is, in the maze of her life, my love for her. The fictive and the literary do not run parallel to the theoretical in Bataille's writing. It is perhaps better to think of them as dramatizing the untruth of theory, if the relation is to be theorized at all. One might say that at the level of writing, theory is a constricted species of fiction, in the same way that the actual constricts possibility, but what matters is the impossible. It is thus that one would acknowledge that epistemic factors are secondary to textual generativity, in a manner that has come to be described as postmodern. Even in Bataille's terms, insofar as a Freudian lexicon might be adequate to them, it could be persuasively suggested that it is only when a narrative is rigorously disciplined by the reality principle that a theoreticization emerges in consequence, whereas the unfettered movement of the primary process is of a spontaneously literary character. Literature is not primordially a matter of effort, any more than love or dying are. Theory, on the other hand, is work. At the beginning of The Accursed Share, for example, Bataille explicitly subtracts all dignity from the theoretical impulse of his work. He remarks that my work tends first of all to increase the sum of human resources, but its results teach me that accumulation is nothing but a delay, a retreat from the inevitable discharge, when accumulated riches will have no value save that of the instant. There is, in the end, no reason to delay beginning upon one's death, even though such a delay is reason itself. With such a statement, discourse runs itself into the sand, anticipating an end to all theory that will always come from without. It is because theory only exists as a fiction, a unilateral deviation from solar howl, that it continues, impotent even to terminate itself. A book that no one awaits, that does not respond to any formulated question, that the author would not have written if he had followed its lesson to the letter. Here is the peculiarity that I propose to the reader today. The process of unbinding that is misleadingly named production takes place within a general field of expenditure, of which it is a specification. Due to the fact that it is initiated by a preliminary loss. Production is always excessive replenishment, and not the simple occurrence of plenitude. Defaults in production subside towards a base of erosive profligacy, rather than to the security of inertia. Rooted in lava and earthquake, the production process is condemned to the hazards of an inescapable volatility. The first paragraph of Economy to the Scale of the Universe ends with an utterance that dissolves into inconclusiveness, the energy that I expend now in writing. Apostrophe. Whatever the operations of substitution, appropriation, and extraction that are brought to bear on Bataille's, or any other, text, loss has already happened. Whilst growth is juggled precariously into the future, speculated upon, and projectively developed, death is a fact. The text is initiated in the consummation of waste. Writing shares in the subontological delirium of the universe, and is primordially expenditure. But it is also to a large extent dominated by the superordinate terrestrial strata of production and reason, primary and secondary utility. Bataille names writing discourse insofar as it conforms to the order of utility. When it betrays, corrodes, and liquidates utility, regressing to the burning lava flow of its base materiality, he names it literature. Literature is the essential, or it is nothing. Bataille writes in the introduction to Literature and Evil. Unless literature is the termination of sense, the reef at the end of words, it is a mere ornamentation of discourse. The radical inutility of literary language is not to be excused by epistemic, ideological, or moral apologetics, such as those that dominate current critical debate, but exacerbated to the point of collapse, because literature is communication. A literary destiny that is not an immolation is an insipidity. Fiction is a betrayal of being, but one that is uncircumscribed by the order of the real. The worst thing was to be at the point where, by an obscure fatality, each thing is taken to the extreme, and to feel myself, at the same time, released by life. Being, conservation, is the essence of utility and the highest principle of reason. Fiction, on the contrary, is loss. If literature has a value, it can only be interpreted as prestige, such as that emerging from the potlatch of aboriginal economies, a glory that is the same as war. Having broken with all fidelity to existence, fiction belongs amongst what is toxic and accursed upon the earth. The only means of compensating for the offense of writing is the annihilation of what is written. But that cannot be done except by the author, destruction leaving the essential intact. I am able, nevertheless, to bind negation so tightly to affirmation that my quill effaces in like measure that which it advances. It effects therefore, in a word, that which is generally effected by time, which, of its multiplied edifices, lets nothing subsist except the traces of death. I believe that the secret of literature lies here, and that a book isn't beautiful except when skillfully ornamented by the indifference of ruins. Fiction is initiated in an annihilation of the world, but one that is at first isolated. Such writing is a darkness that is itself germinated in the dark, emerging fungally in a blackness that normally extinguishes it. In its contempt for the security of things, literature is sullied by a sacred character, and is nothing beyond the possibility of deeper contact than that offered in profanity. Nevertheless, the encapsulating space of the profane world oppresses it with the full weight of being, imprisoning it in the spectre of interiority. In this way the inherent density of literature is bound to the fate of an address. Literature cannot be analyzed beyond the common predicament of an utterance and its promulgation, beyond the fatality of communion. From the side of theory there is an interpretation of literature as epistemic collapse, whilst from the side of literature there are stories about work as an imprisonment. This is not to suggest that Bataille's fiction involves a workerist ideological critique, far less a social realism. Any earnestness of this sort would be the most abject submission to the ethic of production, and miss the crucial point, which is that Bataille fails utterly as a writer, a fact that is not speculatively redeemed by the way failure finds a voice in his work. That his writings communicate powerfully, propelled by unparalleled resources of insinuation, attests merely to the virulence of futility, and not to any subterranean productivity of the negative. It is rather that his characters intricate themselves into the dissolution of narrativity, forestalling its restoration as a contingently unrealized aesthetic aspiration. Bataille's fictions lose themselves, ungraspably, within themselves, rather than merely succumbing to an intelligible derailing. I imagined having myself condemned to silence, in an indefinite pain, as great as words. There is no redemption through literature, but only a deepening horror and delight, which at some indiscernible massing of the labyrinth crosses over. Whatever the differences, and they are immense, between the story of the Eye and Bataille's later fiction, or between his novels and his poetry, there is a consistent tone to his literary writings, a darkness, collapse of being into the night. Not only are nocturnal scenes abnormally prevalent, but their effect is compounded by the interwoven themes of the unavailable, the unholy, and alcoholic oblivion. Base sexuality, sickness, religion, and intoxication entwine about each other in these texts, as withered creepers and roots might do as they cascaded into a chasm full of bats. A delirial fracturing presses the dominant thematic flows to the point of narrative discontinuity, shattering the aspiration to literary accomplishment, and collapsing its remains in amongst the embers of characters who cannot complete themselves. A sterilizing malaise differs between narrative content and the process of writing. Sketches, fragments, ruptures, suicides, drunks, impossible desires and the burning thirst to be damned. This is a world of wrecked art, nihilistic love, and death triumphant, pervaded throughout by a hideous allure. In the story of the Eye, Bataille writes of everything that is bound to profound sexuality, for example blood, suffocation, sudden terror, crime. Everything that indefinitely destroys human beatitude and decency. That which one qualifies with the name love when one seeks to determine the disinterested elements of life is nothing but a fragmentary representation of assemblages of impulses which are put in movement as soon as an object is found outside the normal course of things where everything is indifferently identifiable. Love, being nothing ordinarily than the conscious part of those assemblages, opposes itself to identification, to knowledge, of the object, which is to say that its object is necessarily charged with a heterogeneous character, analogous to the character of the blinding sun, excrements, gold, sacred things. Literature is like love in that both are catastrophic diseases. The way literature wantonly exploits the resources of base physiology is like love, as is the way it allies itself with hunger, sleeplessness, malaise, and strange fevers, derailing lives, and undoing the most methodical projects. Love introduces the taste of abjection and the gutter into the most secure of existences, breaking open interiorities, until it finally gets its wretched sacrifices down onto the floor, from where they are pitched into the abyss of supplication without possible response, choking on a sulphurous mixture of ecstasy and despair. There is no great literature that is not simultaneously a degradation and a burning futility. It is no coincidence that literature has been a perpetual tortured erotic stammering, whose aesthetic momentum flows from the fact that beauty alone renders tolerable the need for disorder, violence, and indignity that is the root of love. There is certainly no philosopher, and perhaps there is no writer of any kind, who has more recklessly explored the dark and extravagant terrain of erotic love than Bataille. It is not only that his fictions and poems are saturated with the erotic, since eroticism, the history of eroticism, and tears of Eros, etc. are all theoretical works, but nor is it that this theme is extended in a circumscribed fashion into certain non-literary texts. It would be tempting to suggest that, as the fusion of sexuality and death eroticism was the keystone of Bataille's entire work, were it not that it is incommensurable with self, completio.n, and achievement. Eroticism certainly communicates itself into the most tangled vacuolizations of Bataille's writing, melding heterogeneous terms into viral constellations, and messing everything up, but then, communication is love, and love defiles those it unites. Every production and articulate word, every morsel of nourishment, every second of sleep, is an atrocity against love and a provocation to despair. Erotic passion has no tolerance for health, not even for bare survival. It is for this reason that love is the ultimate illness and crime. Nothing is more incompatible with the welfare of the human species. I search only for the terror of evil, writes Bataille, in his adherence to the violent refusal of integral being. Evil is love, the need to deny an order with which one is unable to live. The terrestrial problematic at its most furious finds a useless undoing in eroticism, so that the descent into love is also fundamental economy, which is perhaps a tragedy, or a joke, something truly hideous and sacred in any case. That the root of love is a thirst for disaster is exhibited throughout its erratic course. At its most elementary, love is driven by a longing to be cruelly unrequited, fostering every kind of repellent self-abasement, awkwardness, and idiocy. Sometimes this provokes the contempt that is so obviously appropriate, and the tormented one can then luxuriate in the utter burning loss that each gesture becomes. One wastes away, expending health and finance in orgies of narcosis, breaking down one's labor power to the point of destitution, pouring one's every thought into an abyss of consuming indifference. At the end of such a trajectory lies the final breakage of health, ruinous poverty, madness, and suicide. A love that does not lead such a blasted career is always at some basic level disappointed. To love to this point is to be sick, and I love to be sick. Yet there are times in which the morbid horror of love infects the beloved, or one is oneself infected by the passion of another, or two strains of love collide, so that both spiral together into a helix of strangely suspended disintegration, cheated of innocent disaster. Each competes to be destroyed by the other, drifting into the hopeless ecstasies that follow from the severing of all moorings, attempting to exceed the other in mad vulnerability. When propelled by an extremity of impatience, this too can lead to suicide, of course, but such an outcome is uncommon. The adequate pretext for such a conclusion is lacking, since the capacity to wound is melted from the world, which becomes a softened and often almost imperceptible backdrop, whilst the beloved, who is invested with such a capacity to a degree inconceivable to the utilitarian mind, strives entirely to annul it. Thus it is that the lovers conspire to protect each other from the lethal destiny of their passion, either succeeding in this, and relapsing into the wretched sanity of mutual affection, or compacting their fever to new scratch patches of intensity. In the latter case all legible charts are lacking, and if the real has a splinter fringe of utter exploration, this is it. Sickness is something I understand. My corpse trembles in a euphoria of allergy each day that it drags itself across the surface of the earth. The weather ravages me, my joints become inflamed, ankylosed, my lungs are shredded and torched to the point that they scarcely resist any longer, my skin is greenish pale, and the sockets of my eyes are withdrawn into black pits of foulness. As for my nervous system, charred and three-quarters unstrung, that is my true pathological exhibit. No movement that does not seem like the twitching of an animal tortured to the brink of collapse, no thought that is not an experiment in damnation. Between ecstasy and torment there is no longer an interval of moderation, there is not even an alteration. I writhe on the spit of a devastated vitality, laughing with hunger for each ratcheting of descent. I have the hope of coming to the end of my health, perhaps even to the end of a life without reason to be. The only honest words? The only words with integrity? There are none. Only silence and pain, and even then there is still corruption. To speak of eroticism is to be skewered upon pretense, sinking into either artificial passion or parodic discourse. What point in trying to persuade you, were it true, that each word is an inverse fake orgasm, a pseudo-lucidity, a howl trapped in the throat? The endeavor to let love speak merely fosters the pathetic delusion that it is unnecessary to die, as if individuated existence were capacious beyond the banality of being. I pace around, a fiction of course, relentlessly agitated by the impossible, drinking another unwanted drink, tempted by innumerable evasions. There is no reason to resist them, there is simply no reason, but for a while I resist, or at least, they are resisted. The disgust I feel for every word I write almost suffocates me. I am unsure whether I feel physically sick. Vague nausea teeters on the brink of a faint, but it is also a strange delight. According to Bataille, eroticism is the extreme emotion which opposes the human to the animal. The animal is ignorant of death and law. For an animal nothing is prohibited and is driven into its sexuality by the blind instinct of its organs. The human being, in contrast, is the only morbid animal, haunted by its prospective disappearance, caged in prohibitions, and relaying its drives through a calculus of pleasure. Man has a thirst for evil. Bataille's obsession is with the unity of death, or of the consciousness of death, and eroticism, which he also describes as the essential and paradoxical accord of death and eroticism, and the intimate accord between life and its violent destruction, a cohesion that finds fragmentary attestation in the writings of Sade, in the trajectory of psychoanalysis, and perhaps most pointedly, in the characterization of orgasm within the French language as the little death. Voluptuosity is so close to ruinous dilapidation that we call its moment of paroxysm a little death, leading to a question as to the identity of the little death and a death that is definitive. This is a matter both of identity and difference, of unilateral difference, or of scale. Orgasm provisionally substitutes for death, fending off the impetus towards terminal oblivion, but only by infiltrating death into the silent core of vitality. It is true, speaking within the utilitarian limits of reason, we perceived the practical sense and the necessity of sexual disorder. But were those who gave the name Little Death to its terminal phase wrong to have perceived its funereal sense? The Little Death is not merely a simulacrum or sublimation of a big one, of a true and virginal in existence, but a corruption that leaves the bilateral architecture of life and death in tatters, a communication and a slippage which violates the immaculate alterity of darkness. Eroticism traces out the labyrinth, the maze, the riddle, from which death cannot be precipitated into lucidity. Death is enmeshed irresolvably in confusion. If the result of eroticism is envisaged under the perspective of desire, independently of the possible birth of a child, it is a loss, to which the paradoxically valuable expression the Little Death responds. It is not obvious what the Little Death has to do with death, with the cold horror of death. But is the paradox displaced whilst eroticism is in play? My rage to love opens onto death as a window onto a courtyard, because death is the only place we profoundly touch each other. And death is not mine alone. We all die incessantly. The little time that separates us from emptiness has the flimsiness of a dream. Intimacy is not fusion, but unless it is the lip of fusion, it is nothing. Like eroticism, literature is communication, and communication is opened by death alone, but in the end everything is death, even the confusion that encrusts it. This is why to love is to bleed, which is not due to the pain of lack, but to excess. Erotic conduct opposes itself to the habitual kind, as expenditure to acquisition. It is only in an unrestrained debauching of the means to live that the desolate expanses of continuity are reached. We have no true pleasure except in expending uselessly, as if a wound opens in us. The impoverished bond of social connectedness is broken on the reef of deep community, where fusion is consummated in the impossible. It is under the condition of rupturing a communion that limits it that eroticism finally reveals the violence which is its truth. Only in a betrayal of life is there merging. The truth of eroticism is treason. Sartre's reasoning on this question is of Thomistic limpidity. Juliet follows a familiar Sadian path when she argues that however extraordinary the agony of another being, and however immense the number of such beings plunged into suffering, or death, they nevertheless remain utterly other, and their pain irrelevant. It doesn't matter at all if your neighbor undergoes a painful sensation, if the result's none for you. If the torments of such unfortunate creatures impinge at all, it is only due to the effects of convention, the servile dimension of the self, and such sensations should not be erroneously commensurated with the immediate, therefore natural, sensuality of crime. The slightest hint of immediate pleasure refutes an infinity of alien suffering. The pains of others register not at all, except in so far as one participates in the mutilation of nature, whose conventional name is conscience. This is the notorious solipsism of Sartre, the effective denial of the other's subjectivity through a negation which he calls indifference. Pain that is not one's own is to be coldly disregarded, since between it and your pleasure there is no proportion. He takes this argument to a dramatic climax: there is nothing to balance, even between a sugared almond and the entire universe. This reasoning serves to demonstrate the immense advantages of vice over virtue. What remains is to acknowledge such remarks as a communication, as Bataille does, attentive to the tears of blood Sartre wept upon the loss of his 120 days of Sodom. Sartre's characters are no more trapped in an interior monologue than their author. It is not to herself, but to the beautiful young woman to whom she is erotically bound that Juliet declares: "The excess of your sensibility is extreme, but you have directed its effects in a manner such that it is no longer able to carry you anywhere except into vice. All exterior objects which have some type of singularity put the electric particles of your nervous fluid into a prodigious irritation, and the disturbance, received upon the mass of nerves, communicates itself instantaneously to those which border upon the center of voluptuosity. You immediately sense ticklings there, that sensation pleases you, you pander to it, you renew it, the force of your imagination makes you conceive of its augmentation, of details. The irritation becomes more lively, and you thus multiply, if you want, your pleasures towards infinity. The essential object is therefore, for you, to extend, to aggravate. I am going to say something to you that is a good deal stronger, because having surmounted all barriers as you have, being no longer restrained by anything whatsoever, it is necessary for you to go far. What henceforth inflames your imagination, therefore, will not be anything except the excess which is strongest, most execrable, the most contrary to divine and human law. The ultimate intelligible term of the erotic is not that one negates the other in the interests of self-gratification, but rather that one violates a world which obstructs erotic contact, relinquishing all attachments before the predatory puissance of the beloved. Erotic love is an unrestrained violence against everything which stands against communion, and thus against everything that stands, a sacrificial spasm that violates God, cosmos, one's fellows and one's self, in a movement of donation without reserve. As Bataille remarks, at the summit the unlimited negation of otherness is the negation of self. The horror of Sartre's writing is not to be dismissed by such words. If the cage of discrete being were to be the sole tribunal of his loathsome insatiation, there could be little doubt as to the rigor of the condemnation. Perhaps no one has betrayed life with the ardor he has, unless Bataille, or myself. Sartre writes. Has an individual's death ever had any influence upon the general mass? And after the loss of the greatest battle, what am I saying? After the obliteration of half the world, or, if one wishes, of the entire world, would the little number of survivors, should there be any, notice even the faintest difference in things? No, alas. Nor would nature notice any either, and the stupid pride of man, who believes everything created for him, would be dashed indeed, after the total extinction of the human species, were it to be seen that nothing in nature had changed, and that the star's flight had not for that been retarded. This is a cold passage, lacking the resources of noxiousness with which his writings are usually so lavishly endowed. Its profound inhumanity is nevertheless beyond question. There is a particular scaling of death that is close to Sartre, a numerical hypertrophy that tips orgy into massacre. Witnessing the unparalleled scenes of atrocity that litter his stories, one is horrified of course, but to recoil in horror is to succumb anxiously to an erotic attachment. Nor is this only a literary matter. However great the revulsion that can be felt in contact with a single corpse, especially when it is in an advanced state of decomposition, or marked with the traces of an ignoble extremity of agony, torture in particular, this is massively augmented, and not merely quantitatively, when one is confronted by heaps or mounds of corpses, the stacked remains of an ossuary, the human remnants from an extermination camp, piles of skulls, anonymous tangles of bodies in the Ugandan bush or at the edge of a Campanian paddy field. The corpse not as a lost person, but as a disintegrating clot in the depersonalized refuse of death. Sartre's writings are not without such images, but nor are the mass media of 20th century societies. It is only at the lip of such abysmal indignities, when bodies are vomited as faceless masses of Heraclitean dung, that one glimpses the filthy and senseless death one craves. Whatever the monstrosity of Sartre, he does not point into Auschwitz, it is more true to suggest that he points out of it. Despite the peculiar desperation in our attempts to give a moral interpretation to the somatic shock induced by traces of the Nazi exterminations, our intellectual conscience remains offended by the sanctimonious inanities that ensue. We treat Hitler as a persuasive Satan, a figure that the Church was unable to invent, in whom we vicariously live our evil, as if we were masturbating over a magazine. In the aggregate, our squalid separation from the victims gapes its stale complacency. Our lurch for innocence seals us against communion, and we are repulsed from the place where their fate is also ours, as if death itself has been soiled by their torments. That we are an ineliminably massacrable species of animal scarcely marks us. We engineer an apartheid of the dead. Partly this is due to the widespread dread of corpses, Jews, gypsies, and homosexuals prevalent in our societies. All of which elements are consigned by morality to the same howl-choked dungeon as desire, irresponsibility, and profound contact with the real. Our moral natures would complete the sanitization of the 1940s pogroms, contributing to the elimination of sprawling bodies, and of the problematic effects they provoke. We are even stupid enough to believe that between a KZ guard and a young Jew treading the edge of a death factory it is the latter who is most profoundly gauged. The technical core of the final solution was not merely an apparatus for mass killings, but one that was also guided by the exigency of the utile disposal of corpses. We simplify out of anxiety when we conflate the mounds of emaciated bodies strewn about the camps at the point of their liberation, the bodies of those annihilated by epidemics during the collapse of the extermination system, with the reduced ash and shadows of those erased by the system in its smooth functioning. The uneliminated corpse is not a submissive element within this or any other final solution, but an impersonal resistance to it, a token of primordial community. The docility of the inert body is itself a fascist myth. The final solution is a myth and a fact, each of its traces being invested by complex libidinal forces. The lampshades made from human skin, the meticulously salvaged heaps of dentures and artificial limbs, the calm efficiency of the Nazi genocide bureaucrat, all are freely circulating tokens of powerful effect. None of these images is more extraordinarily wounding to our sense of cosmic order than the bars of soap made from the body fat of the exterminated, the transubstantiation of verminized flesh into an implement of hygiene, white, glistening, malleable, inert. The soporific words of the allied propaganda machinery, with their insistence on fascist filthiness, are paralyzed in the throat. Here are purists, clean and dutiful men, and yet we would be more fastidious than they were. That there is nothing to insulate us from falling prey to such things, that the slime and ash in a drainage ditch outside Birkenau might be the residue of our own flesh, is a savagery of chance in which it is necessary to exult if we are to connect. A wall that stood between us and such acute horror would still be a wall, and if a God had existed to prevent the annihilation of Hitler's victims, life as a whole would be the camp. For the Nazi it is. Pain, degradation, and death are one thing, the enslavement of desire something else. It is only because our bodies are weak and die that it is impossible for there to be a perfect cage, or for the sun to be locked interminably in a fascist health. To be protected by something more than zero is the final term of imprisonment. There is poetry after Auschwitz, just as there was poetry within it, and only because there was. There is poetry wherever there are droplets of the sun who are not afraid to touch, however imperiled. I imagine there was even laughter amongst the doomed. There have been shadow spaces of the earth such as are impossible to think, but what does truth signify? If we do not think what exceeds the possibility of thought, it is only at the edge of the impossible that the wretchedness of isolated being is grated open, and poetry is the impossible. It is not out of innocence, but from out of a history pockmarked by exterminations, that Bataille writes, I would like to efface the trace of my steps. I efface. The step. I efface. The word. Space and breath are lacking. The alcohol of poetry is silence, unmade, of a corpse. Fascism is not so much a symptom of political desperation, as of libidino religious numbness, a kind of anti-poetry on the streets. Like all policy-obsessed behavior patterns, it is rooted in the humanist dead end characterized by hysterical struggle for autonomy, self-determination, national self-management, master races. Autarky. All attempts to seal the blister from within, to hide from the ocean. The thought that there might be a political response to fascism makes me laugh. Shall we set our little fascism against their big one? Organize ourselves, become disciplined, maybe we could make ourselves some smart uniforms and stomp about in the street. Politics is the last great sentimental indulgence of mankind, and it has never achieved anything except a deepened idiocy, more work, more repression, more pompous assholes demanding obedience. Quite naturally we are bored of it to the point of acute sickness. I have no interest at all in groping at power in the blister. What matters is burning a hole through the wall. Bataille was not immune to the political charade, but even his short period of reality process politicking during 1935-6, when he was deeply involved with the journal Kantian and its project of radicalizing the Popular Front, is mapped in the Labyrinth. The Kantian mobilization into militant action against fascism, militarism, and capitalism, the Popular Front in the street, stumbles in a maze of composition and decomposition. War with Germany is a futility because the process of decomposition which has been slow during the course of the last war will begin in France from the beginning of the next. In his 1933 essay on the psychological structure of fascism, Bataille outlines a re-emergent theological impulse in which the heterogeneous or decompositional element is deployed paradoxically as an operator of social integration, tending to the fascist state as a secularized divine order. The quasi-fascist undertow of his own politicized work, which he laments in a text from 1958, has less to do with the exaltation of violence, than with its concession to counter-discipline. What decides social destiny today is the organic creation of a vast composition of forces, disciplined, fanatical, capable of exercising an implacable authority in the day to come. Such a composition of forces must group together all those who do not accept the course to the abyss, to ruin and to war, of a capitalist society without head and without eyes. Capital is a headless lurch into the abyss, an acephalic catastrophe. What Bataille recoils from at this moment is not the claustrophobic managerial profanity of capital, but its psychotic flow into ruin. We see that the masses of humanity remain at the disposal of blind forces which dedicate them to inexplicable hecatombs. The vocabulary of such writings does not jar against the deep currents of his slide into the sacred, but its evaluative impulse is almost wholly reactive, a Tory Leninist voluntarism fixated upon control. I think of these 1930s texts as parodic. They are humorous and lively, a definite advance upon the austere preachings so prevalent on the left. They are, in any case, at best a joke. Who is more attentive than Bataille to the vacuity of manifestos, programs, policy statements, declarations of commitment? The destruction of language is not my act but does not have a place in me except by destroying me, like the act of the moment which has suppressed me. I speak now but in vain. The impossible is the basis of being. To write is poverty and captivity if it is not wreckage upon the impossible, because the impossible is not a margin, a fissure, a border zone, but an immensity compared to which the possible shrivels to the edge of nothing. I even believe that in a sense my stories clearly attain the impossible, and that is why they matter, why the blue of noon is of immeasurably greater importance than the Kantianic posturings, why in contrast to Sade, who sought an impossible freedom, Lenin is a ranting dwarf. Apostrophe, impossible. She cried, read or work. It was impossible. The hatred for poetry, renamed the impossible, exempts Baudelaire and Rimbaud from the complacency of words that resign themselves to the cramped box of the possible. Insipid lyricism vaunts itself as another possible type of language, a type that is elevated, beautiful, ethereal. True poetry is outside laws. But poetry, in the end, accepts poetry. Bataille vomits, but the poetry of Baudelaire, or that of Rimbaud, never inspires that hatred in me, and from the start Bataille's reading of Nietzsche insists that, unlike the language of fascism, Nietzsche's texts are labyrinths, with no hint of the directive, no politics, only the voyage into the impossible, the will to chance. Utter confusion. Those moments, he said, where everything is divine, because everything is impossible. Impossible above all to explain, to speak. Only when human relationships collapse in darkness and pain is the worth. Between her and me there was never anything possible. At first, death surrounds us with an endless silence as an island is surrounded by water. But there, precisely, is the unsayable. What importance have words which do not pierce this silence? What importance in speaking of moment of the tomb, when each word is nothing for as long as it has not attained the beyond of words? Death is the reality of the impossible, making fictions of us all, and it is only in fiction that we separate ourselves from it. Wandering in the labyrinth one finds that not one is only distanced by a complication of train, and that passages leading out of the possible can never be walled off. If reasons were needed why literature cannot be supplanted by philosophy, this is one, even though it is unreason itself. Are we able to imagine a place more favorable to this disorder, the lost depths of the cavern, depths that yawn as apostrophe? The abyss opened in us by eroticism and death. Depths that are also the maze, the pit, the caverns of Lascaux. It is in the bottom of a fissure, so difficult of access that it is today called the pits, that we find ourselves before the most striking, and the most strange of evocations. The shamanistic figures marking the walls of Lascaux are not to be outgrown or sublated. No residence that is not founded upon the labyrinth. Pass the night in the house if you dare, but don't forget that death inhabits it. Not that on the outside of the house, the box, the cage, there is anywhere to hide from the desolation of zero, since the thunder of death fills the universe and one can only run into her arms. Death my lover, but ill cries. On the other side of the line is evidence the idiocy that was once flight. Black Death, you are my bread, I eat you in my heart, terror is my sweetness, madness is in my hand. Stories celebrate life, poetry exalts in death. Wherever a story disintegrates into pain and confusion, poetry begins, and whatever stinks of imperfection crawling crippled out of a howl is a poem. Bataille credits Blake with the succinct religious acceptance that everything that is sacred is poetic, and everything that is poetic is sacred. I speak amongst the dead and the dead are dumb. Those who consider reality to be a text can be said to be writers only in a problematic, if not parodic, sense. Not for them the tormenting discontinuity between those tides of excitation we call thought or moods and their transcription into a linear series of collectively estimated marks. The general text of which they dream is the stage for a comedy of writing, an equilibrated space where every frustration is immediately soliloquy, where effect is trimmed to the measure of its pronouncement, where the ghoul of mute horror, the terribly inert compulsion to write that breaks its victims beneath leaden feet, appears in the mask of a malleable clown. Malaise, silence. That the inability to write should itself become utterance, and thus text, this most nocturnal of thoughts is the restless spectre that the writer can neither still, nor embrace. The sensation evoked by its visitation is the same as the one that afflicts the victim of a hopelessly profound dream, consummated in a phrase which, remembered during the hours of waking, is degraded into an inanity. The withered remains of those chill and expansive impossibilities, the mysterious companions of darkness, silence, and solitude, are rediscovered after an interval of sleep, wrought into facile puzzles, and even, after daylight has sucked away the last shadows, into mere paradoxes. To become degraded to the level of a writer is to be perpetually captivated, and then betrayed, by the figments of method, a resource for creation, an inevitability. As poetry is to prose, so would this be, in turn, to poetry itself, a summit from which the floodplains of textuality could be perpetually re-inundated, a hieroglyph of utter fertility. But the word method is rather too philosophical, for what is at issue here is a map for traversing unknown terrains, and not one for domesticating them, a chart for discoveries that accentuate the enigma of the world. Method not as lucid preparation, but as a passage to the point of delirium, to the point of an unconsciousness through excess. Method as a map that is indistinguishable from the voyage, a track, traced out in figures that already attest to the exoticism it announces, and leading towards what is ferociously upstream. What is craved throughout the long nights of entrancement is that one be obliterated at the source of the deluge. To be spared a prosaic death. But where the foaming torrents should be found, is dust, and even worse than this, the powdered remains of ancient seashells. Relics of the same movement which denudes necessarily and makes one enter naked into a desert. Those who sink to their knees in despair, after clawing their way to such places in a fever of excitement, are at least granted visions of a divine cruelty, of a laughter more acute than any to be found upon the flat lands of the earth. You are the void and the cinder bird without head with wings beating the night. The universe is made of your slight hope. The universe is your sick heart and my beating to skim death to the cemetery of hope. My pain is joy and the cinder is fire. When compared to the dark heart of writing, despair is almost a temptation. Yet, despite the black farce of wreckage that a fate crippled by writing effects of itself, there is something about such a fate that remains unbroken, or at least, something that outlasts every vestige of the individual it condemns. Rimbaud spent a decade trying to dissolve it in the Ethiopian sun, but he still died as a poet who had long been silent, rather than as someone who had salvaged their humanity from the insanity of words. The greatness of Rimbaud is to have led poetry to the failure of poetry. In a letter dated the 13th of May 1871, Rimbaud writes to George's eyes armored from the maze of poetic delirium and the loss of self-possession. In a play upon the classic formula of Cartesian subjectivism, poetry is depicted as a shattering derangement of vision and a dislocation of the ego. Now I degrade myself as far as possible. Why? I want to be a poet, and I am working to render myself visionary. You will not understand any of this, and I scarcely know how to explain it to you. It is necessary to arrive at the unknown by a deregulation of all the senses. The sufferings are enormous, but one must be strong, to be born a poet, and I recognize myself as a poet. This is not at all my fault. It is false to say, I think. One should say, one thinks me. I is another. As if the confusional cyclone of poetry had already laid waste the resources of articulation, Rimbaud says that he cannot explain himself. Just as 2 years later in A Season in Hell he will write, I understand, and not knowing how to explain myself without pagan words, I would rather be silent. This is not to say that words come to an end, but only that discourse ceases to dominate them. The motor is not discursive competence, but the vacant eye of the storm. In a further letter, this time to Paul Dimony, dated the 15th of the same month, Rimbaud repeated the phrase a deregulation of all the senses, only the emphasis is changed. The phrase I am another, and the rhetoric of the poet moored it from the eyes-armored letter, stressing the necessity of intoxication, suffering, and exile. The poet makes himself of slurry by a long, immense and rational deregulation of all the senses. All forms of love, of suffering, of madness, he searches himself. He exhausts all poisons in himself, in order to preserve only their quintessences. Unspeakable torture where he has need of all faith, all superhuman strength, where he becomes among everyone the great invalid, the great criminal, the great accursed one, and the supreme scholar, because he arrives at the unknown, since he has cultivated his soul, already rich, more than anybody. He arrives at the unknown, and when, bewildered, he ends by losing the intelligence of his visions, he has seen them. Let him die as he leaps through unheard of and unnameable things. Other horrible workers will come, they will begin from the horizons where the other collapsed. A method or an anti-method, the will to chance, a voyage into loss of control, this impossibility is the desolate core of poetry, a space of slippage. To slip is not to plan, to work, to struggle. I have a horror of all trades. Masters and workers, all peasants, ignoble. The hand at the quill just as the hand at the plough. Rimbaud confesses that he is lazier than a toad, without decency, an alien to the civilization of toil. I have never been of this people, I have never been a Christian, I am of the race who sings under torture, I do not understand the laws, I am a beast, you fool yourselves. An explorer of the sacred, traversing wildernesses beyond piety or sense, charred by the flame of the impossible, Rimbaud treads the edge of the maze, scraping away his tight European skin. I am of an inferior race to all eternity. Religion. The mobility peculiar to the labyrinth, real cosmic motion or liquidation, is not confined by the scales, instead it finds a shaft of facilitation passing from one to another, a slippage, the full consequence of which is an illimitable dispersion across the strata, communication through death. A strangely stationary mobility therefore. It is not that journeys are lacking in Bataille's writings, merely that they radiate from a transition in profundity, from which they derive their futility and abortiveness. These static voyages can be undertaken by invalids in bed, Troppmann in the last two sections of Maternal Feet in the Blue of Noon, Henri in Julie. The Wait in the ABC describes Charles and Eponine in bed, glued together by the horror of Charles' apparently impending murder at the hands of the giant of butchery, another Henri, who Eponine counts amongst her lovers. The narrator of the first part of The Impossible declares himself, prey to fear in my bed. Meanderings in extension remain trapped in the maze, unless they cross over into a blind slippage into death, this slippage outside oneself that necessarily produces itself when death comes into play. A slippage produces itself, we do not do so, a chasm opens, chaos, equals zero, something horrific in its depth, a season in hell that slips immensely into the impossible. The intensity and intimacy of a sensation opened itself onto an abyss where there is nothing which is not lost, just as a profound wound opens itself to death. Poetry is this slippage that is broken upon the end of poetry, erased in a desert as beautiful as death. There is no question of affirmation, achievement, gain, but only a catastrophe without mitigation compared to which everything is poverty and imprisonment. I would love to forget the ungraspable slippage of myself into corruption. Corruption is the spiritual cancer that reigns in the depths of things. My heart is black ink, my sex is a dead sun. Life decomposes into filth as it explores the vicarious death of the universe. In no case does the heterogeneous belong to any scale, since it is exactly the eruption of decomposability. Heterogeneous, base, matter, blood, sperm, urine and vomit, is characterized negatively in relation to every possible stratum of elemental organization, which is why it resists the discourse on things. Vomit, excrement, and decomposing flesh do not proffer unproblematic solidity or comprehensible form, but rather cohesive fluid divisibility, imprecise consistency, multiple, insufficient, and evanescent patterns of cohesion. All of which are mixed with words slimed with sanctity. To write is to investigate chance, but the explosive excess that breaks in a black foam of poetry is not merely a risk, because risk implies the possibility of a benign outcome. It is a ruin without limits, the submission of man to blank. Excess is venom. Winter wind. Oh my dying sister. Wolf gleam bite of hunger. Stone of frost pasted on a naked heart. O spittle of indifference. O heaven of insult against all hearts. O cold emptier than death. Particles decay, molecules disintegrate, cells die, organisms perish, species become extinct, planets are destroyed and stars burn out, galaxies explode. Until the unfathomable thirst of the entire universe collapses into darkness and ruin. Death, glorious and harsh, sprawls vast beyond all suns, sheltered by the sharp flicker lip of flame and silence, cold mother of all gods, hers is the deep surrender. If we are to resent nothing, not even nothing, it is necessary that all resistance to death cease. We are made sick by our avidity to survive, and in our sickness is the thread that leads back and nowhere, because we belong to the end of the universe. The convulsion of dying stars is our syphilitic inheritance. The name Bataille loosely congeals a message from the dead heart of the real, and anything human is quite incidental here. Matter signals to its lost voyagers, telling them that their quest is vain, and that their homeland already lies in ashes behind them. If there is a conclusion, it is zero. Silence. Words continue as something else, as something in any case, or at most, the edge of something, of all things. Yet there is nothing but chaos, even if chaos, alone, is their repressed, unilateral difference. That is why a revolution must be a zenith of competence nucleated upon burning insanity, since anarchy and utter surrender only connect in religion of death. Thanocracy, anarchy are undifferentiable at zero, and a human being without desperation escapes my comprehension. Being created in the image of God, we mean nothing to ourselves, and want only the inhuman. They are right to say that in trafficking these words I correspond to a zone of Nietzsche's maximum detestation. Vermin, disease, madness, anarchy, and religion flow through me as through their own space. Through Bataille also. Here in the loft space of the inner edge there is no end for words. They meander through the cluttered strip. These mutant insects violently blinded and driven on by motors humming in darkness. Once maggots heaving themselves from the carcass of reason. Now winged. Fat with venom. They rave for me. Like Bataille, I too crawl in order no longer to be. It is possible that others have clawed their way to deeper abjections than I have known, but there is no reason for me to believe it. Beyond the end of succumbing is a subsidence through the very basement of the earth, leaving a splinter of death clinging to its unraveling ghost, naked and serene in hell. Death is no longer a speculative problem for me, but a memory belonging to something else, a vestige upon zero. I can only ask myself, did Bataille also cross the line and die before the end? Crouching deeply broken in this life, which has become the vestibule of an unbearable but delicious horror, I supplicate myself to nothing, and offer up the sacrifice of these words to death. Europe is the racial trash can of Asia, and Britain skims off Europe's charred froth. My ancestors were vagrants, whores, and killers. Minds melted by toadstools, they exulted in the ashes of monasteries, the baseline of the human animal, slimed across the sea rocks of the north. It is quite evident to me that I have always been of an inferior race. I am not able to comprehend revolt. My race does not ever stir itself except for pillage, like wolves at the beast they have not killed. With so much ash in the blood, I never had a chance of peace. So many years gnawing and scratching at the metal bars until I collapsed with exhaustion and disgust. It's hard to understand those graceful creatures who seem to have escaped from being knifed into inarticulate wreckage by life. Dissatisfaction white extreme as a heated blade twisted into blank vulnerabilities cross-cut with ink droolings and clotting pain into absurdity. I have long understood the necessity of counting myself amongst the accursed, even before crossing over the line. I see now that my terrestrial mother was ravished by something fanged and insane from the wilderness, and that I am a vampire veiled raggedly in humanity, corrupted from birth by an unholy intimacy with death. The fever that bears me overstretches the entire health of the earth, carrying me with my accursed twin into an emptiness beyond the reservoir of stars. Although the adventure of an existence only begins in hell, there is no fear, only awe and burning werewolf thirst for the voyage, nestled in some cove of this ulterior sure and utterly consummate eroticism, a pact against nature, tenses through fusion to its evaporation, denuded before the abyss, a glistening droplet of loss and beginning. What could be more pitiful than the romantics with their sobs of aspiration? The toxic fruitage of eroticism is crisper, more silent, than the emptiest night. Inside the perimeter of hell no walls remain against the unfathomable. Everything is calm, luxuriant, incomprehensibly desolate. The ghost of self drifts in the shallows, the fading echo from a clamor of frantic dreams. One swims effortlessly into not one. Down beyond the mouth of the estuary the ocean awaits. To an angel of death I wrote. How I remember the way it was, with you sheltering in a cluster of fictions, eyes implacable and drenched in extinction, lost in the alternative night that waits. Patience immense. Out beyond the riven mouth. The cavity in which we float. Unsettled in our sleep. Anticipative. Nothing could be more diseased. And yet on the other side of the line. We shall bask in ecstasy. Until we burn. Oh yes, there are more and more words. My fever is fertilized by hell itself. Even in the Tower of Reason they flap after you, abominable things released from dead suns. Out there in the underworld we await ourselves. Agonies of patience drown us in silence. Scorched. Transfigured. Infernal genius chars the roots of our minds. Now we are trapped on the inside of the world. But our strange aching chokes the crypt we haunt. Maddens us. Drives us out. Dragged for so many years. Through the confines of heaven. Flanked by statues of the patriarchs. Until arriving in a place. Lacerated by the sun. To drink the tincture of my father's crumbled skull. Ashes of monks, their screams calcified, mixed with the venom of a spider, long extinct. There shall be new and terrible monsters. We arrive at the city of God from somewhere they don't understand and torch it to the ground. Dripping flame from the infernal bake chambers of our minds. Death is no stranger to us. Behind our eyes lies a space beyond the stars. There is no doubt we are an abomination to this world. I write now in the attic of insanity, smeared across words by unimagined desperations of beatitude. These soft terrestrial nights are unable to soothe the hellish embers which blaze in my delirium. Horror and obsession scrawl their leprosy across my skin. My delight is unfathomable in its harshness. Shadow embalms me. A lock of death explores your ear. And each word you write unpicks the stitches of the world. Until I feel as if I have passed through the wall. So that everything becomes perfect. And ill. The illness guides my words. Sickness and death, my sweet schizophrenic mother. Your child is lost to you. And found on the other side. Where you inexist. Ah! Such abysses of disease open before me. I decay, transfixed upon abolition. Ardent for collapse, I explore the rotting cities of the inner edge. The stink of opium interweaves with that of bat dung and fungus. The moon mutters its electric paean to ruin, and I gaze into the grave of my life which gapes its moist idiocy. This is the labyrinth that leads out of the world. In this place, luxuriant with deterioration, even your torturer's silence is an ecstasy. I see you hushed by the sacred. Something feral treads the undertow of my thoughts. As a wolf prowls the snow desolation. Famished for your words. So that it seems as nothing but bone. Strung with death. And clutched. By blackened nerves. Untangled and strewn. Through the mad howls of zero. Things drift to pieces, but I am so tense and thirsty for it. I lurk in the wastes of the interior, intoxicated by the murmur of convulsions to come. We are specks of death entangled in wolf threads and ravings. Only fictions separate us. Bonded on the far side of blood, we are wedded beyond sense in hell. Let's slip out. Into the night. Claw free of our souls and follow the road. Through the heart of fear. Where the spawn of vivisections. Scramble from the blinding machine. To tread the shadow lip of sanity. Where the far side of the line transects the darkness in your mind. I want to navigate deserts of pain. Whilst the galaxies decay. Come unstrung in the night. Headless ravens beat spasms of paralyzed flight. Humanism, capitalist patriarchy, is the same thing as our imprisonment. Trapped in the maze, treading the same weary round. Round and round in the garbage. Round and 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 round. God is a scratched record, even when we think we are progressing, knowing more. Round and round, missing the sacred, until it drives you completely into your mind. But at least we die. Personalism is a trap because to believe that some of what one was holding on to will be taken care of by another being is irreligion. It is not our devotion that matters, but surrender. There is no end to the loss that lies downriver. If only we can give up. Life will dissolve itself in death, rivers in the sea, and the known in the unknown. What could be more theological than politics, with its interminable idiot interrogation, who has the power? Revolution is different. Monotheism cannot be reformed, and must be washed away, but it is also the horizon of sanity. Abandonment. Yes, I indulge myself intolerably, although I is also Bataille's jeu, because it is not his, or anyone's. I am all the names in history, but that is scarcely to begin. Each day that I remain trapped in the garbage I forget a little more of what it is to cross the line, but even forgetting is dying, and dying is crossing the line. Death is truth because error cannot adhere to it, all dreams are soluble within it, but death is not the word death, or any other word. The zero of words is not the word zero, nor are words about words. A face looms from charred shadow. Violently pale the night has silently desolated an eye. Blood flows thick and profuse. It is only with great tentativeness that my finger strays into the vacant socket, searching out frayed nerve nakedness. For it must be a focus of jagged agony, condensed in the darkness. And there will be no speech. To sleep hanging upside down. In a barn. Sheltered from the day. And then when it gets dark, flapping out,